All right, everyone. Why don't we get started here? Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today on the day after the big snow. We appreciate everyone coming. I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the president of the Center for the National Interest. We're pleased to have this discussion today about Russia's neighborhood, especially the Caucasus and Central Asia, where we'll focus today. I think perhaps even a little bit more timely in view of some of the things that we heard yesterday from the President and the Secretary of Defense. Looking forward to talking to all of that during the course of our session. Very pleased to have a couple of really terrific panelists. To my left, Andrew Cutchins, who, of course, is a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest, had been president of the American University of Central Asia and living in Bishkek in that capacity. Also, in the past, leading the Russia and Eurasia programs at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at the Carnegie Endowment, and at Carnegie, directing the Moscow Center too, and also some time at Georgetown, actually. And then to my right, Claire Kaiser, who's the head of strategy and senior managing director for Eurasia at McLarty Associates, which I'm sure many know, a really leading, I guess I would say, sort of government relations firm is probably the best way to put it. And Claire has experience living and working in many places in the region, wrote a really major book a couple of years ago about Georgia. Also an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and perhaps most importantly, at least to me, a new member of the Center for the National Interest Board of Directors. So we're very pleased to have Claire with us as part of our governing body here at the center. So we will start with Andy. Each of the two panelists will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions. We are on the record, and as is our typical practice, we're kind of recording to video to put online on the center website and the National Interest website. And by the way, since I mentioned the National Interest, I hope everybody comes and looks at the new website. If you haven't already, we launched a really major redesign of the site a few weeks ago. We think it looks fantastic. We're really proud of that. And hope you enjoy it too. We also have a new feature there, by the way, called Energy World, which is a special section of the site looking at the collision between energy and technology and climate and geopolitics. So I would encourage all to look there. Anyway, with that said, Andy, take it away.
Paul, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. And on the panel here with Claire and Paul. It's my birthday.
Well, happy birthday.
I won't tell you exactly how old I am, but I'll just say that if you added another 6, it would be a very devilish number. So I've had a lot of experience over the last, particularly 16 years, with Central Asia. And I'm going to talk about Russia and Central Asia, mainly. And the conversation, of course, afterwards can go wherever you want it to go. By far the question that I get the most in these last 16 years is about Chinese and Russian cooperation versus competition in the region. So let me start my remarks there about that. I'm going to speak in bullet point fashion. We have, 8 to 10 minutes, so it's sort of a given. I think it's useful to recall that Central Asians have been dealing with Chinese imperialism in various guises for more than 2,000 years. The Russians, by comparison, are relatively newcomers to the region, having come about 175 years ago. And also, while the Russians were imperialists, they were also modernizers. And most of the people living in the territory of Central Asia were illiterate, a significant portion of nomads, etc. And the recent 175 years, Russian imperial experience leaves a powerful legacy culturally, educationally, militarily, infrastructurally, and ties between people, and especially the older generation that grew up under Soviet rule. Now, in 2019, just before I shipped out to Bishkek for my AUCA experience, State INR had commissioned some then classified, now open source survey research on how the Kyrgyz perceived Russia, China, and the United States. So you may be aware of this. About 25% had positive views towards the United States and China. And the number of percentage, this is for Kyrgyzstan, just Kyrgyzstan. The number for positive views on Russia was over 90%. And positive views on Putin were 95%. It's almost like a North Korean survey. I was a little surprised the Russian number was so high, and it has fallen some since the Ukraine war. But overall, the dynamic remains. China is definitely perceived as more threatening to their sovereignty, and that's across the board, not just Kyrgyzstan, both for historical reasons and because China is presently viewed as a rising power. Russia is viewed as a useful hedge, but there are a lot of other hedges out there as well, including the US, but obviously the Russians have a lot more riding on their stake, and the Russians historically are exceedingly tenacious about holding on to territory and holding on to territory that they have influence in. The famous historical term, the gathering of the Russian lands. Well, the great majority of Russian lands were not Russian lands until the Russians gathered them. But once the Russians had gathered them, they held on remarkably tenaciously. And of course, the big two exceptions made the brief interlude of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, my other main point about Russia and China's concerns strategic threat perceptions from Moscow and Beijing that leads them both to lean towards a more cooperative may not be quite the right term for both. I mean, this region is in their strategic rears. China's first theater of concern, of course, is to the east, Taiwan, South China Sea, the US. Secondly, probably Southeast Asia, South Asia. Domestically, Tibet is influential in that mix. And then maybe Central Asia. But Central Asia punches a bit above its weight because of its proximity to Xinjiang province in China and the concerns the Chinese have about Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. But it's at best a tertiary concern. For Russia, the West is dominant, Europe, the United States, then the South Caucasus and the greater Middle East. Note that the Russians do not really view either Central Asia or the South Caucasus as fully sovereign. Each straddles kind of Russian domestic security, and hence the ambiguous term Blizhny Zarubezh, which emerged in the early 90s. It's not quite fully abroad. It's the near abroad, not quite fully abroad. And then in third place would come Central Asia or the Arctic. Thus, for both Moscow and Beijing, stability in the region will and does temper the competitive sides of the relationship, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they cooperate much operationally in Central Asia. For example, I wonder how did Putin consult with Xi Jinping in January of 22 when he made the decision to send 3,000 Russian CSTO troops to Kazakhstan. So let me look briefly in bullet point fashion through the Russian tools of influence in Central Asia, and they are numerous. First, I would say I would think it's fair to say that Central Asia has become relatively more important to Russia, both for its self-image as a great power, as well as for economic reasons, as an alternative trade route to evade U.S. and European sanctions, especially important for imports from China, which have relatively boomed since the full war in Ukraine. It's critical for technological imports to support Russia's military-industrial complex, as we all know. On energy, having lost, at least temporarily, by far its largest gas market and the European market, it has looked to Central Asia a bit to pick up some small portion of the slack. Some Russian oil and petrochemical products are coming this way, and gas. But the big new thing, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago here with Paul and a couple of others at CFT at the center, is civilian nuclear power. And in the past couple of years, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan have shown interest. Russia's Rosatom is certainly expected, I think, to be the main, if not only, international partner here. And Russia's building of nuclear reactors, if indeed it does come to pass, would certainly strengthen economic ties for several generations. I'm pretty confident this is going to happen in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, as they have adequate financial resources and growing demand. I'm a little more dubious about Kyrgyzstan because of the lack of financial capital, and they also have a lot of untapped hydro potential. Also critical on nuclear power issues is the fact that together Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan control about 50% of global uranium reserves, with most of them, of course, being in Kazakhstan. And here I suspect the Chinese and Russian interests actually do not align as they compete in the nuclear reactor area. One of Russia's crucial comparative advantages is low-priced enriched uranium fuel, which for more than 2 decades has been actually a critical import for the United States nuclear reactors, supporting up to 20% of our electrical power generation. And it was not until the fall of 2024, as an aside, that the Biden administration finally put this under sanctions, but I'm not aware whether this has actually been implemented. It's not an easy supply chain to make big changes rapidly on. I personally see it very much in U.S. interest to try to promote Kazakh and Uzbek capacity to enrich their own uranium and serve as an alternative source for the United States. But I expect Russia and Rosatom will fight pretty hard, especially with the Kazakhs. It'll be interesting to see how China plays its cards. The next economic tool to discuss briefly is Putin's Eurasian Economic Union, is the multilateral economic organization designed to be a counterweight to the EU and the West, and China in the East, as well as a tool for promoting Russian economic interests. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are members, along with Armenia and Belarus. The core tension always for the EAEU is to what extent Russia would allow the other member states adequate voice in the organization, as opposed to Moscow simply using it as a tool to further dominate its neighbors. I think in Central Asia, the perception over the last 10 years of its existence has certainly leaned toward the latter. And just last year, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan both decided no, at least now. They've rejected membership in the EAEU. Certainly a public relations and political setback for Russia. It's harder for me to say how significant it is economically, as Russia's preferred option is using bilateral tools to promote its interests. Another very salient set of issues is around Central Asian guest workers, of course, in Russia. And this is a very symbiotic relationship, I think, between Russia, in particular Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Russian labor shortages we're well aware of. The unemployment rate there is at an all-time low since the collapse of 2.3%. So the guest workers have in principle become more important, but simultaneously the concerns have increased in Russia about terrorism and the radicalized, particularly Tajiks, I think, coming to Moscow. And I think I saw a report yesterday of a new piece of legislation in Moscow, which was going to put some more restrictions on Central Asian guest workers, but I haven't had a chance to really follow up on that. So, of course, the presence of guest workers has assumed much greater importance since the full-scale war in Ukraine. let me move on to military ties briefly. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are all members of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Russia's 201st Infantry Division is still stationed in Tajikistan, supposedly up to 7,000 troops there for border protection. But I'm really not sure to what extent this has been hollowed out since the war in Ukraine. And Russia still has the Kant Air Force Base just outside of Bishkek. And notably, as I alluded to earlier, Kazakh President Tokayev called for CSTO help from Moscow in response to the civil unrest in January 2022, and Putin sent 3,000 troops there. I wonder to what extent Mr. Tokayev regrets that, perhaps, but we'll leave it there. The next thing I want to emphasize are intelligence ties, and I don't think this issue area gets enough attention. I think Russia is best described as not a police state, but a secret police state, with the prevalence of intelligence officers both in domestic politics and in foreign policy. And it's underreported and discussed in public debate to some extent because it's not exactly an easy topic to study. I do know the USG tracks this a lot more than open source researchers, but the information is to a great extent classified. I mean, certainly my 45 years of traveling to and working in the Soviet Union, Russia, and neighbors across Eurasia has convinced me that Russian intelligence operations abroad are an exceedingly important arrow in their foreign policy, security policy quiver, and especially in the former Soviet states. For a place like Kyrgyzstan, where I recently spent about 2.5 years, I would say that Kyrgyzstan is not a fully sovereign state because of the domination of Russian intelligence service in the GKNB, the Kyrgyz intelligence services. I experienced this firsthand in a multitude of ways. I don't think that we have time to go into the anecdotes, but I have some rather amusing.
Well, actually, it would be good to
wrap up. Yeah, we're there. We're there. All right. Final note is the large influx of Russians that have come to Central Asia, mainly Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and of course mainly to the cities since the mobilized conscription in September of 2022. It's hard to say actually how many have stayed and how many were passing through to greener pastures, but and of course many also went to the South Caucasus. Mainly Georgia, I think. One of my first thoughts about this exodus of the best and the brightest was that this is also a perfect opportunity to ship out a lot of intelligence assets, actually around the world. Or you have potential assets that can be cultivated in places of interest to you. So, conclusion. In sum, I've been very skeptical for nearly 3 years about the argument that Russia's influence in Central Asia has fallen, and in particular vis-a-vis China, since the full invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. It's a complex picture, as I've tried to convey, and while there is a norm against guns at think tank events in Washington, if Paul were to put one to my head now and demand an up or down answer to the question of Russian influence in Central Asia, I would probably answer it has risen. But fortunately, Paul will not do that. Thank
Definitely not. That's one norm that we will keep in place. Claire Kaiser, please.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Andy, for sort of setting the table with regard to Central Asia. I think interesting to see where some issues, I think, kind of cut across both regions, but there are some clear distinctions as well. So I'll start with a little bit of the domestic landscape across the 3 countries of the South Caucasus, and then talk a bit about the foreign policy. Though, of course, it being the Caucasus, it's increasingly difficult to divorce those 2 topics. So we'll see how we do. It's a little bit of a cliche to say the Caucasus is at an inflection point, but like it actually is this time with regard to geopolitics as well as domestic politics. And I think at various points, certainly in the past, 34 years, people have kind of been making that argument. But I think as far as the post-Soviet, post-Cold War sort of era, we really do seem to be entering new territory with regard to the geopolitical, the security, and the domestic political landscape across the Caucasus. And so to some extent, this was due to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But a lot of these trends, of course, were preceding it as well. So maybe acting in some cases as an accelerant to existing trends. But the story is also far from over. So in Georgia, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has certainly acted as an accelerant in Georgia in the political landscape. And we, I think, see this very explicitly even in rhetoric about that war. Both Georgian Dream as well as elements of the opposition have sort of embraced, looking back at the experience of 2008 and the August war against Russia, on one hand, trying to draw a line from what Russia did in 2008, all the way up to what it has been doing in Ukraine, and saying, hey, Georgia endured this first. We're still enduring 20% occupation of our territory by Russia. Therefore, we need to support Ukraine. The Georgian Dream government has used that, kind of turning it on its head a little bit to stoke fear among the population, in particular their prime electorate, to try to say, hey, we will keep you out of this war that the West is trying to drag us into. Those are two very different interpretations of, the sort of teleology of where the wars have actually sort of taken place and for what reason and by whom. But anyway, I think that's a good sort of metaphor for what the political stakes and landscape look like in Georgia right now, which are highly fraught, I don't even know if polarized is the right word, but the stakes feel higher now than they really have in several decades. It has really intensified, I think, since 2022, but especially over the past year. I think Georgian Dream, and in particular its sort of patriarch Ivanishvili, assumed Russia would win, and I think assumed that pretty early on in 2022. And so that assumption has colored a lot of domestic as well as foreign policy maneuvers that the Georgian Dream government has made subsequently. But it still doesn't necessarily seem like it always follows what one would expect from a, Georgian national interest standpoint or a common sense standpoint. And especially in the past year, has really surprised many, even I think, close Caucasus watchers. So if we want to call this Georgia's illiberal turn, or some are trying to sort of simplify it, I think, as a turn to Russia, which I think is obscuring a lot of important details and nuances there. That is definitely a trend that it feels like a complete 180 from how it had been historically, especially as viewed from Washington. And the war in Ukraine has profoundly transformed Georgian society in a lot of the same ways that Andy said. They've encountered an enormous influx of migrants from Russia, both the IT workers as well as the people avoiding the draft and everybody else. The border is pretty open, and so I think the Georgian government probably does not have the best handle on who is there, what all they're doing, and how long they're staying. But some people have chosen to stay for quite a long time. And this has had important societal as well as economic effects, from inflation to trade figures that look really good on paper and GDP growth and everything. But of course, the sort of lived reality for Georgian citizens looks rather different. We've also seen, I think, certainly in the past 2-3 years, an emboldened Georgian Dream leadership to pursue stronger partnerships outside of the Euro-Atlantic sort of space. China, perhaps most notably, China and Georgia signed a strategic partnership agreement in 2023. So in that window between when they decided to pull the foreign agent law the first time and when they were granted EU candidacy status in December of 2023, they signed a strategic partnership with China. So, just interesting chronology top to bottom. But they've also been trying to, I think, further increase relations with the Gulf, with other kind of, middle powers, or whatever we want to call that sort of group there, while still notionally making the case for EU candidacy in 2023. Of course, that tone has shifted quite a bit over the past year, with really the emergence of Ivanishvili in public as a political figure, even though not an elected one at that point, doubling down on the various legislative initiatives that they had put into place, from the foreign agent law to anti-LGBTQ laws to what I think was probably most important, an offshore assets law to be able to repatriate these assets tax-free for a period. Needless to say, I think a lot of people probably took advantage of that, one in particular. And so this was all in a pre-election environment, of course, and the election took place in late October. That election, of course, took place when we were very focused on our own election. Europe was undergoing its own transition with the new commission. And so I think that likely played into Georgian Dream's favor. The results, of course, were, let's see, surprising to most in their, I guess, discrepancy with what both sides' internal polling had predicted, I think, and then what it looked like, on election day. But it was not to such an extent that you saw the U.S. government or the EU coming out, or the OSCE or other monitoring missions saying, these elections are fraudulent. We need to call for new elections. And so I think criticism, but not kind of going the full way to discount the elections, kind of, left a little bit of a limbo space in that political transition period here as well as in Europe. And so that, again, played into GD's favor. And I think, had that just sort of continued post-election, likely would have probably normalized their government going forward. Instead, they decided to sort of double down on a lot of the electoral promises they had made, with regard to the foreign agent law in particular, but most importantly, and this is what brought people to the streets, and they're still there today, was basically revoking the EU accession process. That was enough to really get a critical mass of Georgians motivated, and not just for a week, but now I think we're in the 70-something days. I mean, it's really quite remarkable how long this demonstration has been going on. But if the ultimate demand, which is, I think, coalescing around having new elections, for that to take place, I'm just struggling to find the scenario in which that would actually occur, short of enough international actors calling for it, or something going, horrifically wrong on the streets, resorting to even more violence than what has occurred to date. So that is an area to watch, but certainly a trend line flowing, I think, or intensifying from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that we've seen, especially over the course of the past year. Armenia and Azerbaijan, and they each have their own domestic politics, but of course are crucially linked by the fate of Karabakh and the post kind of 2023 situation of the Azerbaijan operation to retake that territory. So I think in this case, we need to back up to 2020 and the kind of war before the war, if we're talking about the war in Ukraine, because the 2020 Karabakh War and the roles of Turkey and Russia, respectively, in that outcome is really crucial here, I think, to understanding the new geopolitics of the region, and in particular, kind of a key trend, I think, which is Azerbaijan sort of emerging as like the regional power to some extent, where Georgia maybe had that role previously. And Turkey, of course, is heavily supportive of its close ally Azerbaijan. But the 2023 offensive and operation by Azerbaijan, was a real game changer in terms of the regional landscape. Since then, we've seen a lot of, I guess, reshuffling of the deck from a foreign policy and geopolitics perspective. Azerbaijan has, for many years, much like Kazakhstan, professed a multi-vector foreign policy, trying to kind of, project and play well with a variety of actors in the region. But I think post-2023, there has, I think, seemed to be a bit closer warming of ties with Russia. And Armenia, on the other hand, more overtly trying to increase its Euro-Atlantic ambitions. I mean, they're still members of the EAEU. Their CSTO membership, I think, is going by the wayside. But anyway, we see this sort of divergence of roles there that continues to be something to keep an eye on. But it's not without its complications. And in particular, I have in mind the downing of the Azerbaijan Airlines flight in late December, which happened over the holidays, so maybe didn't register entirely with everybody here. But an Azerbaijan Airways flight from Baku to Grozny was shot down over Kazakhstan. I think it's generally understood to have been caused by Russian anti-aircraft fire. But Russia, and Putin in particular, has not exactly taken ownership of this and apologized for it, which is not sitting well with President Aliyev. So this is a complication in this otherwise, I think, turn or pivot perhaps from Azerbaijan that is continuing to play out. So we shall see what that means over the longer term. But I think that role of Azerbaijan and the extent to which it continues its overtures to Russia is important. And I think the key there is not only the future of Karabakh, but also really taking advantage of the North-South trade corridor, which is something that, of course, Azerbaijan is really kind of uniquely positioned to be able to do. The peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan is another key element. Domestic challenges, of course, in getting that over the line, but it's principally a bilateral discussion at this point between the two governments. It is continuing. It's slow, but I think several of the points have been agreed upon. Of course, the final few are going to be the hardest, and that's been the case for like decades now. But I think given the changing power dynamics, Azerbaijan definitely holds the cards and the sort of key leverage there. But Prime Minister Pashinyan was in DC just last week, kind of making the case to Washington audiences that, hey, we're almost there. Yes, it's still hard, but we are willing to negotiate in good faith. Wouldn't it be great if we could get a deal for peace in the Caucasus? So that's his sort of attempt to try to make the case for why the U.S. should weigh in and care about this region in our new political situation. But that is, from I think the sort of domestic and security landscape in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, the kind of overall picture, it's fragmented, it's multipolar, more so than it has been before. Russia is, on the one hand, seems more dangerous and maybe unpredictable, but also relatively weaker in the region than it has been in the past. And that's principally because I think Turkey is feeling quite powerful these days, and certainly is helpful to its ally Azerbaijan. Iran continues to have interest in the regions, and we don't exactly know how that will play out given events occurring in the Middle East, in recent months. And China is there in new and interesting ways, and not just limited to the Georgia Strategic Partnership. They, of course, are interested in East-West transit, just as Russia's interested in North-South transit. So I think that's their main play. And so, the same methods of building out BRI elsewhere and that sort of thing, I think they're interested in that type of exercise in the Caucasus as well, particularly around the Black Sea. And so I think this is the point where, and thinking about the United States, this is the Center for the National Interest. So what does this mean for us, and how can U.S. engage? I think that might be Black Sea security and how the U.S., European allies, and a potential post-conflict scenario for Ukraine, which that can go a lot of different directions and a lot of different points of time at this point. But one of the other things that Georgia did last summer, the Georgian Dream government, was to grant rights to develop the Anaklia port on the Black Sea to a Chinese state-owned company, which I think is on the U.S. Sanctions list or the Commerce Export Control list. So, needless to say, that's quite a signal. But that plus concerns that Russia is potentially building a support in Abkhazia is not a great sign for kind of looking at that geographic area, and one that I think most people agree continues to be in our interest to have some sort of stake in and oversight of, even in a post-war scenario in Ukraine. So my final point, I guess, on that point is, and I'm still kind of struggling with how to best articulate what the sort of new national interest is with regard to the Caucasus, and I think this would be true for Central Asia too. Now that it's not, support. We're in a different position than we were in the 90s and in the 2000s, I think. And so much of the discussion on Russia's war in Ukraine and the post-war order, and we'll see what happens this weekend. I don't know. I mean, things seem to be picking up with regard to potential ceasefire negotiations and everything. But there's a lot of talk about European security, obviously, and NATO and everything. But perhaps obviously for this group, whatever happens with the fate of Ukraine and Russia's role therein will have profound impacts on the Caucasus and Central Asia and everything that touches it. And so we just want to be sure that these unintended consequences, be they security, economic, social, are actually managed and anticipated to the extent that they can be, because whether it's regional stability, economic issues, like that has to be part of thinking through what the immediate term and the long-term sort of plan looks like going forward. Because otherwise, I just think it opens up too many critical vulnerabilities that would be very difficult to sort of rein back in down the line.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire. So we'll open it up for questions. I want to ask one first, though, just to get us started, because I think there is sort of one big obvious question related to the war in Ukraine. Will there be a peace agreement? Will there not be a peace agreement? And what kind of impacts does that have in Central Asia, in the Caucasus? And I guess as I look at it, there are kind of three scenarios, broadly speaking. No deal. It doesn't work. And then who knows what happens after that. There's a deal, but it's a deal that our European allies and the Ukrainians don't particularly like that much. But they sort of have to go along with that. And then thirdly, there's a deal, and our allies and the Ukrainians maybe feel somewhat better about it. Perhaps they're not thrilled by it. Everybody is going to have to make concessions of one kind or another, I expect, in order to get an agreement. But I think the success case can be sort of better or worse, from the perspective, again, of our NATO allies and Ukraine. So thinking about sort of those three possibilities, and very brief, actually, because I really want to open it up. We have 30 minutes, so, please just 90 seconds or something. Andy, what do you think could happen in Central Asia? How would these various cases affect the situation, or maybe there's not a material difference?
I think there's some material difference, but I would be wary of actually overestimating it. I think that the Caucasus is, just because of geographic proximity and sharing, in particular, the Black Sea, how the conflict gets resolved is going to have a considerably larger impact than Central Asia. Central Asia can't change its geography. These are 5 landlocked countries. Uzbekistan is double landlocked. They've done a remarkable job, I think, impressive job, that they're still independent countries. Their sovereignty is not questioned anymore. and their game has always been to play, and I think this is true actually of the three South Caucasus states as well, is to try to play some kind of multi-vector foreign policy, to have additional options and directions to go in. And so in particular, these states aren't as dominated as they could be by Russia and China. So if there's a no deal, then we kind of continue on the track that we're on. China's position, of course, is critical. If China were to reduce its support for Russia, well, I think that would have a big impact on Russian policy, of course, and how it. But still, I don't, again, because of my opening remarks, that this is kind of a tertiary or even a fourth level security concern for Russia and China, Central Asia. What is Central Asia central to? It's the strategic rear for many for great powers as well as for regional powers. So I wouldn't leave it there.
Great, thank you. Clay.
So let's see. I think maybe two subpoints to your scenarios here on no deal. I mean, I think that could go a couple of different ways. No deal means the U.S. government says, fine, like we're done with Ukraine, let's move on to something else, which, needless to say, would have huge impacts not just for Europe, for Ukraine, but also for the Caucasus, because I think institutionally, the Caucasus are still part of sort of, European bureaus and that sort of thing in the U.S. government. But I think also geographically and I don't know, philosophically are still pretty linked to things that happen in Europe, and so that would have a profound effect. If there's no deal and as a result, the further penalties come on Russia from the U.S. and partners, and potentially also further support to Ukraine, then that's going to have a very different effect on the Caucasus. And so I wouldn't maybe oversimplify the no deal scenario. I actually think that is worth more fleshing out. But
there are
that's,
different kinds of no deal scenarios.
Yeah, there are. I think bad deal and better deal, and maybe my sort of counter there is deal for how long? Because I think a short term, an immediate ceasefire, a quick win, hey, this is the first 100 days goal, let's get peace and then we can move on to other things. Okay, of course, Ukrainians' great fear, as is I think most people who've been following Ukraine for some time now, is that, okay, we're just going to have Minsk 3 and then Russia will do this again in a few years. No one wants that to happen, but if that is sort of the grounds that we lay through a quick ceasefire and then trying to pivot away, then again, that doesn't do anything to further European security or U.S. interests in the region. I also think we need to deal with the asymmetries of how Russia might be looking at a potential deal or peace process and how the U.S. in particular might be looking at it. Is it a ceasefire or is a ceasefire the beginning or the end? If it's the beginning of a larger multi-year negotiation on the future of European security architecture and arms control and Arctic affairs and all of this, then that's going to take a lot of investment and time and patience. And it remains to be seen if that's something that the U.S. administration wants to do. But all will have huge impacts on the Caucasus, but I think my sense at this point is that that's not a huge sort of factor in the considerations of decision makers at this point.
Well, let's open it up. I know we have one here, one there. Please, and could I ask you all, please, to give your name and your affiliation?
Picture ID, right?
You're right,
Yes,
right.
Michael Vlahos,
National
Institute
Identity Card.
Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. So, from the mid-1830s to 1905, the British Empire engaged in what they called the Great Game against the Russian Empire, and 2 Afghan wars, fought a war with France and Italy against Russia, Crimea and elsewhere. Almost came to blows with Russia again in 1878, finally fought a proxy war through Japan, which brought Russia to its first revolution. The U.S. in the last several administrations, or several of the last few administrations, arguably has pursued a similar kind of strategic great game, and with varying success, and rather aggressively in some areas. And it includes several of the Central Asian and Caucasus republics. And since the war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk about continuing to work to bring Russia down or apart. And the whole idea of a great game is really borrowed from the 19th century and has not, from what I can see, been given up here in the precincts of the imperial city. But there is a different situation now in town. And I'm wondering what you think about the future of the great game strategy as it has been practiced for the last 15 or so, 20 years by the U.S. Along the Russian periphery, whether you see the new sort of element of restraint, anti-imperial voice in Washington holding this back, or whether you see it sub rosa resuming again as sort of the coin of the realm of U.S. strategy against Russia.
So will the administration kind of continue to contest Russian? I think is Michael's question.
I need an interpreter.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Claire.
Well, I mean, I think the bigger question is probably on China and what the administration's medium and long-term sort of objective is with regard to China. I do not have the answer to that. I would not profess to be a China scholar, but I think that's sort of the key question from which a lot of this will flow. Yes, the Russia piece is important for all of the reasons that you just mentioned, the sort of historical legacies and the geopolitical terrain, I guess, and stakes in Central Asia, I think, more explicitly with the Great Game reference, but also in the Caucasus. I think certainly with the Caucasus experience, the lessons of reflecting on policies from the U.S. side in the 90s and the 2000s and more recently, people are starting to confront their hubris, I think, a little more than they were willing to. Looking at the events in Georgia, certainly, but also looking at actions both in Azerbaijan and Armenia as well, and in the broader kind of external parties engaged in the region. I think the inevitable march of democracy, the inevitable sort of liberal openness, just that feels very old at this point, but it wasn't that long ago that was just the march of history, and we were all along for the ride. I think this region has certainly seen its share of challenges around that sort of developmental philosophy and trajectory. But I would expect that to be a point of departure with this administration as well.
So basically, you're saying the U.S. will pull back from the great game side vis-a-vis Russia, being chastened by recent experiences, including Ukraine, but will be more primed to focus on areas close to China.
Perhaps, but I think don't discount the wild. Perhaps, but don't discount the wild cards. I think there are things outside of anyone's control, right? I don't know if anyone expected Assad to fall, a couple months ago. Like things will happen that will reshuffle the decks and reshuffle the global map of how countries are considering their national interests, and then they'll balance that accordingly. That's always true. That's not unique to our times, but I think you can't discount that either.
Absolutely. Anything to add briefly?
It's such an easy question.
Right.
Thanks, Michael.
That's why I went first.
If I'm looking back at the last 33 3+ years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I see a combination of catastrophic failure and success. On the success side, I would say, yes, there are, these what were then newly independent states remain independent. On the catastrophic failure side, obviously, is really what's happened to Russia, and the fact that we have a massive war between Russia and Ukraine. And, we can argue till the cows come home about how much we contributed to that, but just looking at results, that's kind of how I would evaluate it. Where we go from here, I think there are mixed. I think Donald Trump's instinct is he really doesn't want to get us into wars. That's one thing he's been very, very consistent about, and I would say he really differs very much from neoconservatives, who were dominating the George W. Bush administration. But then, on the other hand, the China question, again, I think that there would be less likelihood of war, frankly. But on the other hand, you look at some of the appointments that have been made. So you have a guy like, Bridge Colby in the Defense Department, who is as gung-ho about, militarizing, ramping up our containment of China through military means. And I think I personally think it's a very risky play. But so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I have everybody. Let's go first to you, Mr. Ambassador, and then Mark.
Thank you very much, Slovak Ambassador. Thank you very much. And perhaps we'll expand a little bit what we are talking about. Small prelude at the beginning. I'm glad that we are talking about our interests in Central Asia and Caucasus, not the values, because interest is what we should be driven in these days. And I think our main interest in, at least from my point of view, of coming from Slovakia, Caucasus, to be as close to Europe as possible for many reasons, including that if that's the case, then the other parts of axis of evil, whatever you call it, will have a more difficulty to get closer to us. So for only that small reason, it's really important for Europeans, for Georgia to remain on certain trajectory towards Europe. Now, all the difficulties we know, it's not on the cards now. But when talking about Europe, there are two schools of thoughts. One is closer to current Republican establishment here, more sanctions, being tough on Ukrainian leadership, denounce the elections as or pronounce them as a fraud and the government being fraud. And there's another school of thought saying, well, don't push them too much because then we will lose them. Yep. So what will be your advice if you have this crystal ball? How to deal with Georgia and by extent to Central Asians as well, because they look how we deal with them. Not to lose Georgian faith in good relations with Europe and the path towards the European Union. The last thing I will say, it's highly unlikely that the European Union will say, Georgia, you are off the hook. You are not coming to European Union. Right. This is not the case. The European Union is going to say, we like Georgian government to blink first. Right.
Can I sharpen the question a little bit?
If that's okay.
Sure.
I think part of the question for Europe also is to what extent does it matter that Georgia shares European values as opposed to kind of being in the European camp as a security partner in one way or another.
Partner, yeah. So I think Europe's relationship with Georgia, looking over the past couple of years, has actually been very interesting because I think, on the one hand, the EU feels like it's more present in the region than it really has been ever. I mean, it's just across the board, extremely involved, extremely present, just kind of constant attention from the EU level, as well as key member states, I would say. And similarly in Armenia, though I think in Armenia, the momentum is coming from Armenia more than from Brussels. And so I think the current kind of political crisis in Georgia has also laid bare a little bit on the competing voices within the EU. And I don't just mean Brussels versus member states or between member states. You have kind of the EU and the foreign policy apparatus of the EU saying one thing, which isn't quite the same as what various member states are saying, which of course that divergence is going to happen. That's natural, and that's the point. The parliament saying something, the council kind of doing its own thing. And I think just that discordance has made it difficult, I think, for the opposition in particular to kind of find champions with regard to counterparts in Europe. And so I think my sort of advice on how to keep Georgia in the European camp, which something I personally want, I think it's in the U.S. interest as well, and certainly in Europe's interest, is despite disagreements among those various institutions, to try to speak, with more of a unified voice, I guess, around Georgia, rather than having these various kind of competing or sometimes conflicting outlets around it, if that makes sense. Certainly the demonstrators in the opposition, I think, would welcome that, but I think it might also compel, be a little bit of a reality check with Georgian Dream as well. But no, it's really challenging. And then, I mean, from Armenia's perspective, they're quite focused on their European and EU aspirations, which is pretty inspiring to see. I mean, that's one of the sort of bright spots, I think, in the region. So hopefully we can make sure that they can continue along that path. And that's something that Pashinyan talked quite a lot about last week as well.
Andy, you have an additional
two brief points. And one is kind of related to Michael's question earlier. When we play the great game and we try to, and it veers towards a zero-sum choice for the smaller states on Russia's periphery, it puts them in a very, very, very difficult position. We recall, that the Ukraine war actually started initially as a dispute over the EU versus the over Russia's Eurasian economic union, and that goes for Central Asia and for the Caucasus. The difference in the Caucasus, I think, just to put a point on it, is that Europe is a bigger factor. Europe's really not a serious factor in Central Asia, and obviously China is a much bigger factor. The other point I would make in broadly is that, talking about inflection points, I think we may be how the resolution of the Ukraine war goes, or lack thereof. I mean, we are there. I believe it's inevitable that the United States will continue to pull its security orientation from Europe, and the Europeans will need to develop more of their own resources for this. Look, this is 80 years after the end of World War II. It's 34 years after the end of the Cold War, and I think this would be a healthy thing, actually, both for the United States and for Europe. But the devil's always in the details and how it takes place. Break all the furniture and just throw NATO in the trash heap tomorrow. No, but my beef with I'd like to see Europe have more of an independent and robust security presence, and so that they would be less likely to follow our lead, as we've seen, into what I think have been extremely counterproductive wars and military interventions over the last 20 years or so, in particular with Iraq and Afghanistan being at the top of the list.
Thank you, Andy. So we have 9 minutes and a few questions. So I'm gonna double them up, actually. So the two Marks first.
Robert Katz, George Mason University. Andy, you referred to the January 2022 Russian intervention in Kazakhstan, and then indicated that maybe Kazakh government isn't so happy about that now. And I'm just wondering why. It seems to me that didn't the Russians withdraw their troops, or am I wrong about that? And it seems to me that from the Russian point of view, that Russia intervened to save this guy's bacon, and all he's done is repaid them by taking advantage of Russia with regard to the war in Ukraine, serving as profiteering from sanctions busting. In other words, has Russia gotten anything more from Kazakhstan than it would have gotten otherwise had it not intervened and the government remained stable? But it doesn't seem to me that Kazakhstan has been as supportive as it could have been with regard to Ukraine. Certainly did not return the favor of Moscow protects the Kazakh government. What did the Kazakh government do for Moscow?
Mark Episcopos, the Quincy Institute.
Thank you. Thank you for the trenchant discussion. I was wondering, zooming in on the great game in Central Asia, to what extent is China having trouble projecting its soft power into Central Asia because of the perception on the part of many of these countries, especially Tajikistan, perhaps also Kazakhstan, that China is pursuing an anti-Muslim agenda, especially in light of what's going on in the Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs, and this perception that Chinese influence means a stamping out of the Muslim faith in these countries. And isn't this an area where Russia seems to have a comparative advantage? Because Russia really, it seems to me, has taken steps to disentangle itself from the Soviet secularizing model and has projected this attitude of respect toward Islam that seems attractive to many of these countries. Thank you.
I'll start with Mark number two. I think that's right, Mark. Although I don't think that I would have expected that the Chinese public image would have suffered more from the treatment of their Muslim minorities just across the border than they have. But they have a major public relations problem in these countries, and it's more because of the nature of how they've delivered their assistance, as they do to many other countries in the world, particularly the issue of Chinese workers. The terms on which these deals have been made in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, and the corruption that's involved in them. Certainly, those are much more salient issues, I think, for Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Tajikistan is harder to say. They've been more willing to sell themselves lock, stock, and barrel to the Chinese than the others. On Mark's question, yeah, I agree also with you, Mark. I guess what I was surprised that Tokayev went to the Russians so quickly. I'm skeptical that actually the Russian troops saved his bacon. Now, but he certainly did make lemonade out of lemons, in that, what started as demonstrations and riots over gas prices, it was able to turn that into a house cleaning and domestic political consolidation in reducing the power of the Nazarbayev family. Now, how Vladimir felt about that in Moscow, I don't know, but that's what's happened. And you're right. I mean, the Russians didn't get much back, but then on the other hand, I mean, 6 weeks later, they're on to their war in Ukraine. So Kazakhstan, I think, was a distant memory.
Anything to add, Claire? Let that one go. Okay, who else do we have? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Andrew Neary with the Atlantic Council. Thanks very much for this excellent discussion. Claire, you mentioned earlier about the U.S. should engage somewhere in the transport that's developing, especially east-west, between Central Asia, the Caucasus, and then onto Europe. I think the U.S. government has been a little bit reticent to engage fully because they're wary of facilitating a bunch of trade from China to the EU. Where do you think the U.S. should engage?
So I think, the middle corridor pitch has been one that certainly all the embassies have been making for a long time. I think it, and by day I work in the private sector. It's one the private sector from the U.S. side has been pretty reluctant to latch onto as well for all of the reasons that you might guess. It's an ambitious plan, but a complicated one, like in terms of trade, in terms of, top to bottom, it's an ambitious but complicated agenda. And I think, yes, it achieved a bit more significance potentially post 2022, but I still think it's a challenging sell for the U.S. and Europe. I think it's something that China is trying to do what they can to solidify that, but there still remains a lot to be seen as to the actual value and in particular commercial viability of a lot of those projects. Anakli is a great example, and that's a long and tortured saga, of course, one near and dear to the first Trump administration's heart. But and there's a whole story to that too. But anyway, I think for as much ink that has been spilled on the idea of East-West transport corridor with the Caucasus and Central Asia kind of as its hub, there's a lot more on paper than there is in practice at this point, and I think time isn't making it any more practical, I suppose. So I would be cautious in being too optimistic about all of that.
Great.
Just to, if the Trump administration does go through and actually do away with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that will make U.S. companies, make them be able to be a little more competitive with Russia and China in this part of the world. I'm not being totally facetious. Yeah, the middle corridor, it's been touted a lot since the Ukraine war, and avoid the going through Russia. The middle corridor has got its own massive challenges. There are a lot of countries, there are a lot of borders. Borders tend to act as toll booths on transit issues, and it's multimodal, so it's complicated. I think there are drivers in the regions themselves where it'll develop somewhat, but as some kind of significant alternative to ultimately going east and west through Russia. And of course, when the war is over, that'll come back, I think. And of course, sea trade is the huge dominating issue on that, or meme mode.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that, and thank you, Claire. I think we had a really terrific discussion. We're grateful that you could all join us today, and hope to see you again here at the center soon. Thank you.
Thank you.